So I asked ChatGPT in Bing AI search to help me find a funny quote about hybrid work. True story. Turns out that there's nothing funny about hybrid work because I couldn't do it. This quote, however, really resonated with me. Harvard business professor who said, what makes hybrid work kind of interesting is it's the only kind of work that we still don't know how to do. I'm Ryan Herbst. I'm chief strategist and a principal at unifiedcommunications.com. We're a partner. We're based in Houston. We work with enterprise and mid-market customers on modern work. And I've had the pleasure over the last couple of years of working with literally hundreds of customers on their hybrid work strategies. And I'm here today because I have concluded that hybrid is by far the best possible model. Now, here's 3 questions. I hear these regularly. I assume you see these questions, you hear them regularly. Are we returning to the office? Are we staying remote? Is hybrid a superior model? Is it a business advantage? Or is it simply a perk that we're being forced to provide? Well, we think overwhelmingly the answer to all 3 of these questions is yes. So in this increasingly challenging economic moment, in this post-pandemic era, hybrid is and will continue to be challenged. Today, you're going to hear some predictions. We're going to talk about why hybrid is theoretically a superior model. We'll talk about some of the dangers to hybrid success, things that people are just doing wrong. We'll shine a light on 3 companies that are enjoying great success with hybrid. And then we'll look at some areas, culture, technology, workplace, hopefully some nuggets of goodness that you can take back with you to make some change in hybrid in your organization. And I'm hoping that leaving today, you'll also feel a little more empowered with some recent data to have a more informed conversation with anyone who wants to challenge the model. Again, expect it to be challenged this year. This brings us to our first prediction, that hybrid is, and we predict, will continue to be the dominant model. Now I'm going to show some data, but I just wanted to note first that I worked really hard when preparing this content to make sure that all of the data that you see is recent and fresh. With this moment, April 2023, feels very different than April 2022, feels very different than December 22. So it's really important that the data lines up. A lot of what we see quoted in terms of studies, things that all of us see regularly, is studies that were born in 2020 and 2021. So it's important that we had recent data. So let's start with the Fortune 100. Arguably, pretty impressive set of customers. They're generally thought to make pretty good business decisions. They have a lot of resources. Of the Fortune 100, 92% of them are currently hybrid, 92%. Drilling down a little deeper, of the 100 companies that make up the Fortune 100, 2 of them are remote first. 6 of them are office first. We hear a lot about these 6 in the news. 92 of them are hybrid, meaning they allow employees to work outside of the office at least 1 day a week. Now, quick show of hands. I want to see how this room kind of lines up in terms of hybrid dominance. Raise your hand if you work for a company that is remote first. All right. I would expect a bit higher percentage in this room than kind of in general. Raise your hand if you work for an office first company. 0. Raise your hand if your company is hybrid. Okay. So even in this room, hybrid is dominant. Let's look at some more recent data. 2023 study, global study, looked at hybrid capable workers. These are people who could work remotely, not frontline. Of those that could, 6 in 10 were part of a hybrid team. 6 in 10. 2 other recent studies, work from home research, Bloomberg study, looked at multiple models. Almost half of those that could worked for a hybrid company. On the right, this was both a US and global study, looked at different models and popularity. Hybrid was dominant in the US and even more so globally. Now the trends are really interesting. This is Gallup data that went right up to the end of 22 into the beginning of 23, and it shows hybrid on the rise, 53%. Remote work declining, and office first relatively flat. Now, remote work declining is particularly interesting. If you had asked me a year and a half ago, most of us would have probably thought that remote work was going to be the dominant model. Many of us knew people, maybe some people in this room, who got up and they left major metros and they went and moved somewhere really rural with a lot of confidence that if they lost that remote first job, it would be easy to replace. Unfortunately, many of us also know people who have been caught up in recent tech and other vertical layoffs, and it turns out that replacing a remote first job, not that easy. Remote first is declining, and hybrid continues to rise. Now, the office is an interesting place to also establish whether hybrid is happening. Meaning, if we were all back in the office, we would see office occupancy around 100%. Now, Castle Systems makes access control technology. It's deployed in office buildings around the US. For the last couple of years, they've been measuring swipe data and averaging top 10 cities and coming up essentially with an occupancy rate. And what they're finding is that it's averaging at this point around 50%. Now, this data is imperfect. It's been criticized. They're not in every building. For example, in New York City, there's some large law firms that are largely in person or spending a lot of time in the office in their hybrid that are not Castle customers. So if anything, it might underreport a little bit, but it's around 50%. And the trends are interesting. March 2020, essentially 100% occupancy. COVID takes place, goes down to less than 10%, and it's been steadily increasing since then, but is now plateauing, again, around 50%. The when and where is interesting. Now, newsflash, Friday is the least popular day in the office. Tuesday is the most popular day. And some of the geographic differences are interesting as well. In New York City, there's a huge spread, over 32%, between the low, again Friday, and the high Tuesday. Texas cities at the top, you could say a more conservative culture in Texas, a bigger push to bring people back to the office. So looking at those Texas cities, their lows are higher, their highs are higher, and the spread is more narrow. But again, on average, this is averaging around 50%. Now, maybe a little bit comical, but the water cooler data is also lining up with this 50% number. So Bevy Systems makes an internet-connected water cooler. They're deployed in around 5,000 companies across the US. They were doing this pre-COVID. They're looking at how much water they're dispensing this time in 2023 compared to the same period in 2019, pre-pandemic, and they're dispensing around 50% of the water that they dispensed pre-pandemic. Now, some of the office data is interesting in helping one to establish that hybrid is happening. I think that's clear, but it's also where big bets are taking place. That companies are not expecting this to be temporary. Now, the amount of space per employee has, in fairness, this was falling well before the pandemic. It went into a bit of a free fall. It is expected to stabilize somewhere around 160 to 170 square feet per employee, but this is not that long ago. It was around 210 square feet per employee. And it makes a little sense. I would ask you to just close your eyes for a second and envision the hybrid office that you would create based on everything that you know today. It probably has some pretty amazing spaces. It probably is built for human connection and engagement and energy when you come in. It's probably in a fairly premium space. It probably has a lot less private offices. Hot desks take less space than private offices. If you're doing hybrid right, we'll talk about this some more, you're probably getting some modest real estate gains. You can reduce your footprint a little bit. That means that you're not bringing everybody in on a fixed Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday schedule where you have to plan for peak capacity. And so it makes sense that we're getting some modest reductions and that we can deal with less square footage per employee. Now, this data is a bit terrifying, particularly if you're in the commercial real estate business. It's coming from Cushman & Wakefield, who has a real stake. They have no interest in making the situation look any worse than it is. And what they're finding, number one, is that the majority of new lease activity is taking place in this ultra-premium top 15% of the market, Class A plus buildings. And again, this probably lines up with that vision in your head when I asked you to imagine the hybrid office you would build. It's not taking place in a dumpy B and C class building. The scary part, going from the bottom up, 25% of the office buildings that you drive by every day in this country are functionally obsolete. They have super high vacancies. No one is renting them. No one will rent them. They would either have to be torn down, they would take major investment, they'd have to be repurposed to something like multifamily. And there's a whole big swath in the middle that's very, very questionable. But again, this lines up with where the big bets are happening. They're happening around this concept of a hybrid office. They're happening at the top 15%. This brings us to our second prediction, that hybrid will be a business advantage to those that do it right. Why is hybrid an advantage? Well, I'll ask you to think about this concept of tailwind, because you could argue that almost any work could be done almost anywhere. But on the remote side, for example, many of us went home in March of 2020, and this light bulb went off, this epiphany, that we could do focused work again. We didn't have the interruptions of the office. We left an open office. We were past the stage when everybody had enclosed offices. And we had tailwind. It was easier to do focused work. Now, some of the advantages on the remote side are obvious. Some of them are less obvious. This concept of reduced absenteeism and presenteeism. So in the past, I may have had a bad head cold. I may have called in sick. Given a remote option, I'm less likely to do that. That has real cost savings for an employer. The opposite concept, presenteeism. I'm an overachiever. I have a perfect attendance record. I have that same cold. I am going into the office. I'm going to infect everyone else. They'll take a couple of days off, but not me. This is also less likely to happen given a remote option. Now, there is tailwind in the office as well. It is largely centered around human connection, engagement. There is a magic that happens when we are together like we are in this room. Some of the advantages, again, are obvious. Some are less obvious. Amazon CEO recently called out this concept of serendipitous interactions or dynamic networking. And so this is the idea that I'm in the elevator and I'm on my way up in the office and I strike up a conversation with somebody from a different department. They mention a challenge or a problem or an opportunity. A lot of innovation has come from these kind of loose networks. This type of thing is much less likely to happen in an all-remote world. Advantages of in-office. So in theory, you bring these two concepts together, you have something superior. And when hybrid is done right, there's generally some modest cost savings that ensue as well. And they're coming, one, in the form of small reduction to real estate footprint, some ability to optimize, maybe shut down some certain floors on certain days. But in general, the companies that are doing this well are consolidating their footprint a little bit. They are seeing some modest productivity gains. The data on productivity is a little all over the place, but it's always showing some, mostly coming from the remote side. We know that there's this ability to do better focused work at home. Not having a commute creates some additional time. This data shows that some of that time, not all of it, but some of it, employees are giving back to their employer. So there's some productivity. Reduced employee turnover is huge. That's a significant cost savings. And interestingly, you can also improve your culture. I say interestingly because culture has been one of the things that leaders have made a case that certainly against remote work, that it wasn't possible, but they've also made the case that building and growing a thriving culture was harder to do in a hybrid world than it was in Office First. But the data says otherwise. So a recent 2023 study looked at satisfaction with a company's culture, and the highest satisfaction was coming from people who worked for a hybrid company. Another study, Gallup poll, asked employees how connected they felt to their company's culture. And of the subset of employees that felt strongly connected, the majority of them worked for a hybrid company. Again, this is super refreshing from a leadership perspective. Now, this brings us to prediction number 3, that unfortunately, many organizations will not see the benefits of hybrid, will consider reversing course. There are some real dangers to hybrid success. Let's talk about them. One of them, big one, is a lack of policy or guidelines. And this data is particularly terrifying. This is recent. This shows that of companies that have said they are in a hybrid model, the majority of them either have no guidelines or very ambiguous or informal guidelines. And by guidelines, I don't mean just putting a stake in the ground saying we're hybrid, everybody shows up Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. I mean real guidelines that talk about the technology we're going to use to make hybrid work. How decision-making is going to take place. Is it across the board, or hopefully are we going to push some of that decision-making around when and where down to a team or manager level? How are we going to make sure that when people show up in the office that they find their teammates there? What framework are we going to put in place to measure the effectiveness of it? All that kind of stuff has to go into proper guidelines. Not having guidelines can create this concept of commute regret. I know there's probably a couple of you looking at this saying, I would love this, but, and it's true, there are some people who have trouble doing focused work at home. We have to have a place for them in the office. But that's not the average reason that people are coming to the office. They are coming for human connection, and this type of thing can be a real danger to hybrid success. Another huge danger is this one-size-fits-all approach. Everybody comes to the office on Tuesday, Wednesday, or everybody comes Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. This fails to consider the differences that take place between teams and the nature of their work. There are teams that do highly individualized work. They would benefit from the tailwind of being at home most of the time. Maybe they should be in the office one day a week. There are other teams that do highly collaborative work. They would benefit from 3 or 4 days. Maybe they're doing training and onboarding. Doing it one size fits all is a huge limiter. Another huge danger to hybrid, I like this guy. Another huge danger to hybrid success is these outdated kind of concepts of some legacy management styles, command and control or line of sight management. For hybrid to work, you have to be able to measure outcomes. You have to be able to measure success criteria. And you have to be able to measure adherence to a timeline. This is proving to be particularly challenging in certain geographies. For example, in certain countries in Asia, this line of sight management is deeply ingrained in the culture. If Stephen's a great employee, he shows up at 7, he leaves at 7:30. This does not work for hybrid. We could argue this is not effective in any business, but if you're unwilling from a management perspective to kind of take a look at management style, leadership style, you're probably better off not even trying hybrid. It'll fail. Now, many of you in this room have seen this data. This is coming from Microsoft, their Work Trend Index, and it speaks to this disconnect between hybrid employees who feel really productive when they're working remotely and leaders of those same employees who have big questions about the productivity of those same employees when they're out of the office. But this really harkens back to the last slide. Like if we're measuring based on outcome, based on objective, based on success criteria, there should be no question about whether people are productive or not. Another huge danger to hybrid success is proximity bias. And like other biases, this can be a fairly natural human concept or condition. And so proximity bias says that the people around me that are in close proximity and line of sight, I tend to believe are working harder or smarter. I tend to believe that they're the most productive. It begins to create this halo effect where those folks get promoted and others that may be outside of my line of sight get passed up on promotions. Proximity bias is a cancer. It can really drive a wedge through hybrid. And you combat this one by talking about it at a leadership level. You have to put it into your policy. You have to mandate frequent interaction, touch points, one-on-ones, particularly with folks that are on a hybrid schedule or a remote-first schedule. Proximity bias is a huge, huge challenge. Now, this one probably plays well in this room. Kind of newsflash, turning on your camera has an impact on engagement. But it's shocking how many meetings all of us are in regularly, sit inside hybrid organizations where cameras are not on. And it's a challenge. This is one of the reasons that hybrid is not working. All of these are reasons that companies are really struggling with hybrid. They may call themselves hybrid, but they're not getting full benefit. So let's talk about 3 companies that are finding real success with hybrid. Now, all these folks have a couple of things in common. One, their revenue has grown steadily throughout the pandemic under this model and into this post-pandemic world. They all consider hybrid to be a business advantage, not just a company perk. There's some other similarities, technology that you'll see as well. Let's start with Kellogg. We all know Kellogg, household brand, 32,000 employees, 80 locations. But pre-pandemic, Kellogg was largely in person. They had a handful of IT folks that worked remote, but they were largely in person. Fast forward to today, their program is not one size fits all. It's called Locate Your Day. It is pretty sophisticated. As a Kellogg employee, I meet with my manager. We talk about where I live, where the office is, the nature of our work, my deadlines, and we come up with a hybrid schedule that works for both of us. Kellogg made some big investments in their office space. They have bookable hot desks, they have Teams rooms, they have Teams panels. They have a review board that meets quarterly that looks both at personal and room standards that they push out to the businesses. They're very committed to making sure that they are able to participate in this fast pace of innovation. It's not a one-size-fits-all, sorry, it's not a snapshot in time. It's an ongoing process. They shared that hybrid has been a net positive impact on culture, and they had a couple lessons learned. One of them was that they were seeing a lot less hot desk bookings than they had expected. They were seeing a lot more use. They were seeing, hey Michael, they were seeing a lot more requests for their shared spaces, for their rooms, than they had predicted. Now, this makes some sense because they are doing it right, meaning people are coming to the office for human engagement and connection. They're spending a lot of time in shared spaces. Yes, between meetings, they're grabbing a hot desk, but they're not booking a hot desk and staying there all day. And so they're considering making some changes, converting some of their hot desks to more shared spaces. Well, let's hear from Dan Belichevitz. Dan is an architect at Kellogg. He owns collaboration and meeting rooms.
I think in order for hybrid to work, you have to create meeting equity. So whether you're in a room or at home and so forth, you want to make sure that everybody feels like they're present and everybody feels like they have a voice. And so you're going to do that with proper meeting room kits in your rooms, depending upon the size and dimension of the room. And then at home, you're going to make sure you have proper setting and so forth. Cameras generally always on and so forth to create that inclusiveness for the users. You'll have 10 people come in a room and they'll all join the meeting and mute themselves and have their cameras on. So if they are talking and they're, in the active speaker window, they'll get picked up. And so that's one of the ways that we're doing it. So I think people are smart enough to figure those things out on their own. It wasn't even something that we promoted to people. They just were like, well, if I turn my camera on, people can actually see me. These are my opinions and not the opinions of the company that I work for.
Disclaimer. Yeah, when Dan talks about people walking into a conference room and just turning their camera on, he's talking about the companion mode idea, the concept, the feature within Teams rooms and the Teams client. I just wanted to point that out. That can be particularly helpful if you have a large specialty space or environment where you want to turn 10 or 20 or 30 cameras on at the same time. Next up is Rich Products, global food manufacturer, 12,000 employees. Like Kellogg, they were largely in person pre-pandemic. They are now hybrid. Rich went through a very sophisticated workplace renovation. In fact, they don't call their headquarters an office anymore. They call it a collaboration center. It was built based on task, meaning, yes, they have some spaces that are dedicated to focused work, but it was largely built around teams coming in for a particular purpose. And so it could be a team of 2, could be a team of 25. You come to the office, if you were looking to create something, ideate, brainstorm, you go to a particular type of space that has interactive technology and whiteboard, Surface Hub, different furniture. If you're looking to have a standard meeting, there's spaces for that. They spent a lot of time. From a workspace perspective, this stuff just doesn't happen naturally, but they created a hybrid workspace that's probably a lot like what you all envisioned when I asked you to close your eyes. Last up is Accenture. Like the others, revenue continued to grow over this last couple of years under the hybrid model. Now, Accenture is absolutely huge. If you look at the world's largest companies based on employee size, Accenture is number 4, 720,000 employees, 120 countries. They spent the first year of the pandemic polling their employees, polling their customers, and really trying to envision what the future of work meant to them. They came up with this concept that they call omni-connected experiences. They were, in their words, trying to get beyond the constraints of spaces and places and We'll hear a little bit more about how they think about omni-connected experiences. But one of the other things they did was they created a mobile app, this concierge app. You can use it to book a space or a hot desk. It's a wayfinding app when you come in. It guides you to that space. It's your badge. You can ask for help through it as well. Like the others, they use Teams rooms and Surface Hub and Teams panels. They have beacons deployed across their physical spaces so they can gather some good data on how to make good decisions and optimize the use of those spaces. They have an enterprise metaverse with replicas of their physical spaces that is widely used. And from a culture perspective, hard to argue, they were voted top 10 great places to work in 2022 in 6 different countries. So their omni-connected concept, very similar to a lot of the things we're talking about today. It takes modern leadership. It takes a focus on culture. It takes flexibility, and it certainly takes a big investment and focus on technology. So let's hear a little bit more about how Accenture thinks about omni-connected experiences.
Feeling connected.
Being included.
Knowing we belong.
This is omni-connected. It's about ensuring everyone has equal quality of experience,
No matter where they work.
And every voice is heard.
True omni-connected experiences comes down to us.
And our behaviors.
And the technology we use.
Together we foster environments where we build a sense of community in our teams.
Where we look out for each other.
And take the time to care deeply for each other.
Where we understand the flexibility we all need in our work and lives to support our individual well-being and productivity.
Because when we all feel seen, safe, and connected,
Regardless of our physical locations.
We are empowered to speak up.
And have the courage to voice our needs,
as well as our ideas.
Omni-connected doesn't mean being connected all the time.
It's about being connected in smarter ways.
and knowing when it's time to disconnect too.
Through omni-connected experiences,
We will evolve and grow together.
For a new and better way of working.
Let there be change.
All right. So we've talked about just how popular hybrid is at the moment in terms of dominance. We've talked about why hybrid is theoretically superior. We've talked about some of the real dangers to hybrid success, things that you just don't want to do. And we shined a light on 3 companies doing it well. Now let's talk about some of the really actionable steps and things that you can take back with you to your organization to help fine-tune hybrid and make it work better, starting with technology. Now the home office is, unfortunately, 50% of hybrid for some. It may be a third if we've got co-working spaces in the mix. But this is a portion of hybrid that has been largely neglected. Yes, in March of 2020, organizations in haste, purchased some corded USB products and sent people home. They made sure Teams was deployed. They taught them to turn on their cameras. But not much has happened since then. We talked about this concept of tailwind, that you can do better focused work at home. Trying to do everything that you can to empower employees to do that. It's true that we have less interruptions at home, but we do have interruptions, and they're different. They're barking dogs and doorbells. So a strategy from a device perspective focused on home, not a snapshot in time, is important. We talked about Kellogg's approach to this. They meet quarterly around device standards. We have to think about things like portability. Some of these devices are going to travel with us from home to the office to be used at a hot desk. Portability is important. We have to think about device management. How do we keep track of these devices that sit outside our corporate firewall? How do we make sure that they are optimized? How do we make sure that they update firmware? All of that type of thing, super, super important. And one size really doesn't fit all. It makes a ton of sense to be able to offer some choice to employees based on their preference. Ultimately, we have to make sure that they can see and be seen, that they can hear and be heard. And many of us daily sit on calls where we realize this investment just hasn't taken place. So not hard, we're not going to go into the speeds and feeds in particular devices, but a little focus on home office, both one time and making sure it's part of an ongoing program, can go a long way. Now shared spaces, we've spent guys have probably been in, I was in a good session this morning with Michael talking about this. It's not just about throwing some tech at a room. Yes, we can buy a Teams room, we can throw it at a physical space. For hybrid to be successful, it has to be a super engaging experience, both for the folks in that room and for the folks remotely. You do this by taking a portfolio-based approach based on space, based on capacity. And we would argue that some subset of your spaces should be dedicated to particular purposes. This concept in the top left of a signature Teams room, if there is a team in the office that is going to have a meeting with a client remotely, having some subset of your spaces that are optimized for a cross-the-table engagement with a remote team can make some sense. We also talked about this idea of ideation and brainstorming. That's a different type of technology, and so dedicating some percentage of your spaces to particular types of activities, to tasks, can make a lot of sense. Hot desks need to be both super simple to connect to. They also have to be powerful. It can't be that I have 2 large displays at home. I come into the office and I have a small single display. Yes, if we're doing hybrid right, I'm probably there mostly for meetings, shared space, human connection. But in between those, I need something powerful. Too many hot desks not meeting the standard. This concept of Teams panel is proving to be pretty interesting in a hybrid world, meaning, yes, we all knew the concept of scheduling panel, but the idea of some technology that will help us release one of these valuable resources if somebody books it and doesn't use it, technology that will alert us if the room's at capacity, technology that will help direct us to another space if that space is booked, technology that will help us book that space in front of it, technology that would allow us to create a custom app that we may write or some Teams app that we use and pin that to something that you could access in front of the room is proving to be really valuable. Now, back to shared spaces for a moment. It is essential to understand and to keep up with both Microsoft's roadmap and the roadmap of the particular device manufacturer that's making the room. There is a lot in play going into later this year, into early next year, around this concept of multi-camera, this concept of center-of-table camera, concept of virtually directed center-table multi-camera, the IntelliFrame concept that Michael talked a lot about in his session. To take full advantage of this, you have to keep up with the roadmaps. We spend a lot of time focused on helping customers pick the right horses in this realm. And there's a way to do it because there's a tendency to want to kind of wait and continue to wait. There's always something that seems to be better right around the corner. But if you do the work, you can collaborate in 2023. You can do this in more of a staged way where you deploy technology and you can bring in some of this newer technology incrementally as it comes out. And there are huge differences between the device manufacturers. There are differences in terms of how they think about their camera AI. There's differences in the physical installation. How many cables go between the table and the wall? What type of cable? There's differences in their device management platforms. There's differences. Super important that you pick the right horse here. Now, this concept of connected workplace is either going to be, depends on how you look at the world, this is a missing piece of the puzzle or icing on the cake. This is going to be huge. Microsoft's answer to this is Places. This is coming later this year, and it's going to help hybrid workers and companies make more intelligent decisions in a couple of ways. One of them is around scheduling. So it may suggest to me, for example, because it has access to my Outlook Exchange data, access to Teams, access to Viva, access to Grid and AI, it may tell me that, hey, Tuesday would be a great day for you to go to the office because 72% of the folks that you collaborate with most closely are going to be there. Or in a day that I'm in the office, it may tell me, hey, we looked at traffic data, and now would be a really good time for you to go home. You got enough time to get home, you'll save 30 minutes in traffic, and you can do your last meeting from home with that type of intelligence. On the booking side, if I decide to take it up on Tuesday, it'll help me book a hot desk that's in proximity to the folks that I'm working with, or book a space based on the nature of what we want to do. It's going to know how many people are going to attend that meeting in person and remote. You can imagine with the ChatGPT capabilities, there's a lot it could do to help me find the right space. And lastly, it's going to help optimize space and cost. So intelligent cameras on our room systems can count people. There's other environmental data that can be collected at the room level. There is sensors. Many of them exist today, but there's really inexpensive sensors. We've looked at some sensors that are 7-year batteries, and they're wireless, and you just plop them up. So there's sensors that could measure hot desk. They can look at parking lot. They can look at lockers that you may make available for folks. They could be attached to anything. But all of this data, plus integrations with building management systems and other systems, will funnel in to dashboards and historical data to help companies make good decisions. Some of this could be, hey, I can shut down floor 1 and floor 7 on Monday and Friday. We'll reduce this concept of commute regret. We'll get people closer together. We may save a little bit on HVAC and some cleaning costs. Or it may tell me that, hey, this particular type of room is highly utilized. We need more of them, but there's a bank of hot desks on the west side of floor 4 that are never used. Maybe we should convert some of them. Some of that type of intelligence. Now, the physical workspace, I had asked everyone to close your eyes and kind of envision the hybrid space that you would build. I think a lot of us realize it takes a lot of intentionality. This is likely not the space that we left when we went home in March of 2020. We talked about some of the companies, and all 3 of the organizations that I spotlighted have put major, major effort and investment in the physical workspace. And yes, we want to make sure that the key is really flexibility here, diversity of spaces. We need this whole range from highly social to highly focused. We would also argue that some of these should be task-based. The furniture side is huge. We did an experiment in our organization. We took a room that had been updated with some recent room technology. The only thing that we did was change the furniture. And that room went from being one of the least popular rooms to one of the most popular rooms purely based on furniture. It can make a huge, huge difference. I would argue that in this hybrid modern workplace, there's probably not a lot of room for the traditional boardroom table for the dark wood styled stuff. It's a lot more flexible. And depending on task, if it's ideation and creativity, it could be beanbags or cafe height stuff. It's really, really an important piece of it. Certainly we need the hospitality elements, cafes and libraries and kitchens. But ultimately we have to take a step back and think about how we're going to make sure that this oozes human connection, that this invites me to collaborate when I walk into this space. A little effort here, again, a long way. And lastly, and probably most importantly, are the things that we need to do around culture. This is really the reason that hybrid is not working most of the time when we kind of peel back the onion. Measure outcomes, not outputs. This is fundamental to this concept of hybrid. We've talked about you have to be able to measure objectives and results. It just doesn't work otherwise. It didn't work well in an Office First world, but it certainly doesn't work in hybrid. You do this, everybody needs objectives. We need to be able to measure their key results. I love Microsoft. I don't know if they coined it, but I first saw it in this concept of no KR, helping people appreciate not just what they should be doing, but what they shouldn't be doing. Vitally important to the concept. Doing this will help to curb and give leadership this confidence that people are working. This will curb the productivity paranoia, the proximity bias kind of challenges. And certainly everybody should have really measurable. If you're not familiar with SMART goals, I'll ask you to, you'll get my presentation, please look it up. But really, this type of thing is super, super important to hybrid success. This is about that modern management. Simple little tip, don't call it RTO. It sounds really punitive. None of the companies that I highlighted call their program that. It also doesn't speak to the benefit and the reality that when we talk about hybrid, it's not just about the office. So you can see some examples of what some large organizations have named their programs. Leadership needs to sign up for this idea that they're leading a hybrid company. This is fundamental, and it is a different world than leading the company that many of them grew up with. They all have this memory of what was a very office-first world that they grew up in. You worked your way up, you moved to the corner office. It was all about the office. In order for hybrid to work, they have to communicate much more frequently. They have to be able to, from a cultural perspective, spread the word, help everybody appreciate why the policies are the way they are, the why, the when. They have to help ensure that when people come to the office, they find their teammates there. And they need to be living this hybrid schedule. There's far too many organizations right now. The leadership is in the office full-time. Employees are living hybrid. If truly there is tailwind in doing remote work, what we talked about, there's more focus, they need to be able to be living that. They also need to be able to relate with the rest of the organization. So really, really important that leadership signs up for this idea that hybrid is a different animal for them to lead. Now I'm going to slow down here. This is super important. So one of the most fundamental kind of failures that's taking place right now is a lack of alignment between the activities that take place in a particular location and where we have tailwind. So we know that there are certain activities that take place with more tailwind in certain locations. So MIT did some research. They looked at essentially 4 types, but most tasks fall into 4 categories. And some of them more naturally happen in person, and some more naturally happen remote. Social tasks. We know that training and onboarding is not working well remotely. It's just not. So there's no reason to fight that headwind. If you have a hybrid office, if you have a physical space, move that back. It's not a reason to change, make a tectonic shift and change the whole model. You shift that piece of it back. And so the real work is working to align at a team level the tasks to ensure that when Michael comes to the office on Tuesday, his day is spent largely on the types of tasks that make sense for in-person versus the day that Michael had on Monday. And this is much easier said than done. This is really hard work, but this is one of the true keys to hybrid success. And lastly, we have to refresh our policies. And so we talked a lot about this in the beginning, but it's super, super important. Hopefully, it's not one size fits all. Again, one size fits all, this everybody comes Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, is very, very short-sighted. So hopefully decision-making also is pushed down to a manager or team level, is not at a top level. Ultimately, these policies should help align that work, which you saw on the last slide. How are we going to ensure that that happens? How are we going to measure it? We're going to make sure that when Michael shows up, he finds his teammates there. This is fundamental. And lastly, we got to collect feedback. We're all certainly learning. This is a voyage. Anybody who thinks they've got this all figured out is probably on the failure side of the coin. But you need systems in place, and you certainly have to set the stage internally in a company that they should expect to see changes over time. They should expect to see it evolve. So it's my hope that having gone through this journey, that number one, you feel more empowered with some recent data and some information to have a more informed discussion with anyone who wants to challenge the concept of hybrid. You can evangelize the idea that it is a superior business model. I'm also hopeful that you were able to find a couple of nuggets of goodness that you can take back to help fine-tune hybrid in your organization. I would ask you to take 30 seconds and maybe write them down if there's some things that you want to take back. These types of conferences, once you leave the room, it can quickly leave your head. So let's just take 30 seconds so you can kind of codify anything that you'd like to take back. So we have some time. I would love to get your feedback, take some questions. This is a really interesting topic at the moment. I'm sure part of all of our world daily. So yeah, feel free. If you've got some questions or comments or feedback, would love to hear it.
So, companies like Fang, right? They have a lot of perks for going into the office, free food, free laundry. But they are also requiring you to come more into the office, right? Do you see more of a trend of people saying, no, those perks aren't as quite important as I thought. Being able to work from home is more important than my laundry being done for me, or free food, or all those other perks.
So the question was, a lot of perks are being provided on the office side, hospitality things, it's free food, laundry. People are doing a lot to try to coax folks back to the office. The question is, do we see that trend continuing, or are people pushing more on the remote side? I would just say from the more sophisticated they get, the more they realize that it's about aligning tasks and making it work at a team level. This kind of loose concept where either everybody decides when they come in just doesn't work from a productivity perspective. And I think the big fear right now is that as we hit these, as we go deeper into a potential recession, that leaders are going to want to revert back to what they knew. Their reference point was all office first. They're going to be pushing for that. And so I think everybody really needs to step up. And yes, it may be convenient to be able to say, I work when I work, where I want to work, but it really doesn't hit the productivity level of saying that we're going to engage, at least at a team level. We're going to make sure that we're going to work together in the office when we can, where that's practical. It can't just be complete. And so I think when that begins to happen, it's less about attracting them more to the office. It's more about looking at where the activities make the most sense. I mean, some teams really should be home most of the time based on the type of work they do. Others should be in the office, and when they're there, hopefully they get those perks. But I think that concept of attracting them with perks is more for what a lot of companies are doing really wrong, which is just leaving it up to an individual employee to decide when they want to come into the office. Yes, sir.
So we heard from Ted's keynote this morning the latest stats on that there's 6-7% of conference rooms in the world are video conferencing enabled. And we have a plethora of great technology providers here, Microsoft itself, Jabra, Galen, Crestron, Qualitech, Lenovo, and I can keep go on. What do you think are the top things holding it back? Or maybe you think that only a certain percentage should have video conferencing?
Yeah, so the question is, video conferencing is still, and this was stated in the keynote, in single digits in terms of penetration, and what's really holding that back? It seems like the companies, they're doing this in stages because the reality is most companies are struggling with hybrid. It's really the kind of reason that I've certainly felt passionate about trying to share any of the insights that we're seeing. But to the extent they start doing it well, I think they are equipping rooms based on the number of people. But I think the more intelligent, some of the pieces that have been missing are things like places. I mean, they don't have good tools right now to be able to capture utilization, to really understand demand and occupancy. They don't have there's not a lot of sophistication in the analysis of what type of room and how it's working and how do we measure engagement. I think as we get more empirical data, it's going to make customers feel a little more confident. But I think there's just a certain reality right now from an economic perspective that it's a real wait and see thing, and there's a lot of companies are still really unsure of a lot of their real estate decisions. That's holding them back from making big investments, and so they're real measured. They're doing it in small waves, but would expect as this hybrid thing begins to mature, that as hopefully companies begin to figure this thing out, that they're going to equip based on the demand that they have. And but for some organizations, it's going to be a smaller overall footprint, but it should be a lot more shared spaces, a lot less dedicated private space. And so, yeah, it'd be interesting to go into that data a little more, just to see kind of within particular segments, like, for those that consider themselves hybrid, what is that percentage, versus the office first world that we would expect to be down in those lower single digits. Louis. Yeah, that loose concept of everybody comes when they want to come is definitely contributing to kind of the lack of investment on the room side, because people aren't showing up. But at the same time, the companies aren't getting the productivity and so there's a big risk in organizations that are structured that way, that they overcorrect back to all in person as things get tougher. And so I think that's the big push here, is to say we should get proactive inside the organization, because it might be fun to be able to just say I go when I want to go, but the reality is when times get tough, leaders are going to go back to what they know, which is an in-person model.
Back to the office, it isn't just about the good coffee machine anymore. It is about comfort and things like that. That's why people invest in really expensive chairs and nice furniture and stuff for them to sit at and do their thing. But meeting rooms are being equipped more and more based on trying to attract people to get in there more. And when you think about hybrid's not a new concept. A video meeting room, by its very nature, is a hybrid space.
Right.
Because some people are there and some people are somewhere else. And sometimes it's between different meeting rooms, sometimes it's between different people, sometimes it's between all of the above. So, hybrid isn't new, but we're now doing it as a hybrid for ourselves more than just a hybrid with customers, suppliers, and external people and stuff. So yeah, it's interesting that, and a lot of the technology you mentioned, the AI cameras and those kind of things, are actually going to kind of speak to that and actually improve the experience in such vast ways. I work for Logitech, and we coined a term about making it better than being there.
I couldn't agree more. It is, but the challenges are largely on the leadership and culture side. I mean, I was sat at the keynote and somebody said to me today, hybrid's not going to work because when people are remote, they just multitask. It's not a technology problem. It's a leadership and culture problem. And yeah.
On top of that, too, you've got kind of the tendency for the executive C-suite and kind of senior leadership levels to often say, we'll just all get together and meet in person because, they'll do that and kind of push the hybrid model or other modes of doing work downstream, and then you have these two different cultures inside of it.
You do.
They don't feel the pain that the rest of the organization maybe feels.
And they're not taking advantage of, yeah, I couldn't agree more. Miriam, I thought you were going to shower me with questions.
I was going to ask because there's several industries that they are very traditional, very hierarchical, and you see like oil and gas is one that I come from, that definitely they believe that in the office you're more productive. They're bringing people back, and they think that just because you're in the office you're more productive. And we were even talking before the session that when you are home,
This is
exactly. So when you're at home and people say you're multitasking, yes, there are people with two jobs, and it's in the news everywhere. Part of the layoffs, people are proven to have two jobs. But when you're in the office, you have more breaks. Now I have meeting, no break. And before we would have walked around, talked to our coworkers. So what I think is missing is a true understanding, if the culture is going to change, there is some verticals that will need way more help to view, to understand, and embrace that.
Yeah, so the question is, are certain segments, certain cultures, certain sectors struggling more with this concept of hybrid? There's no question. And for some of them, they probably shouldn't even try. I mean, it's going to fail. If you can't measure based on outcome or success criteria, it's going to fail. They're going to, and I guess I wouldn't care if if that remote employee is meeting all of their objectives, they're bringing all their projects in on time, they're hitting all of their goals. If they can do that with another job, more power to them. But that doesn't exist. I think you came from unfortunately, oil and gas is one of those industries that is a kind of laggard from a modern management perspective, and there's a lot of this kind of command and control, line of sight management, and hybrid just doesn't work. I mean, it struggles. It will fail.
I'll make comment that one of my largest clients is a commercial real estate company. And when the pandemic hit, there was definitely fear within the industry. At least they're West Coast focused, mostly SoCal, but all of it now. And they're growing and selling more office space now than ever before. Much of that comes from the ability to acquire things at a cheap rate as everyone does. But to your point, they're also making them very modern, very nice, attractive spaces because the demand has not diminished.
Yeah, there's
from their perspective, people in seats, butts in seats has not gone down. If anything, it's gone up with modern technology.
Yeah, there's no question that I think this top 15% is enjoying like great success, and I guess if your business model is getting a deal on this bottom 25, but it takes some serious investment. I think that the scary thing from a commercial real estate perspective is, yeah, if you own a lot of that kind of Class B, Class C stuff, something significant has to happen. We've had a huge fundamental shift, and it's just not desirable anymore. Something significant would have to happen for it to be utilized again.
Yeah. I think there's also two hidden benefits in the hybrid work story that kind of gets missed out. The ability to create a more accessible working environment for organizations, especially when done right. And then kind of a side to that would be temporal hybrid work, where you have different people working different times, and the globalization factors that come into play there too, right?
There are some huge advantages, yes. And some of that's more on the, I guess, on the remote first side, because you might get folks that are far enough away they're not necessarily coming to an office. But you're right. Yeah, there's some big benefits. I was kind of focused on kind of the hard across the board, but there's no question that there's, from accessibility and a quality perspective, hybrid has opened all kinds of doors. And then certainly there's an ability to go recruit without geographic boundary, which can be huge.
Yeah, I think some of that loss of it gets, it's the HR story then, and the facilities, and you're bringing IT, facilities, and HR together, which obviously creates a giant decision maker cluster.
Yeah. So anyway, interesting. I think the remote work declining side is also super interesting and a little bit terrifying. But we're seeing just I think all of you unfortunately are probably seeing this as well, that remote first jobs are getting harder to find, and people that are losing them are finding them harder to replace. And hybrid seems like hybrid is the right balance, and in theory it's superior. So it should be where we're pushing.
If you have to be in the office, you're limiting your talent pool to that area. The chances of finding, I don't know how many staff you might have in a company, but 10,000 rock stars all live right there. And I know there's a lot of people that actually move, whole states and whole countries
right.
for their jobs because it's based on actually going there. But I've been remote for 3-4 jobs now, 9-10 years, something like that. And yeah, there are times you go to the office where it makes sense, where there's something happening or something like that. But it just means that the talent pool is not limited by geography. So yeah, it should be on the increase.
Totally agree. Any last thoughts?
So there is one thought that we were researching, like the amount of senior people that would be averse to IT. They would go to the office, but they would need IT to come connect the room for them. They would need IT to come and connect the camera for them.
Right.
When everybody went home, everybody had to learn. So the hybrid work also brought a lot of self-learning about IT to a lot of levels. That is unprecedented. So there is other benefits of hybrid, and I don't know how we're going to capture that, but it's definitely way less tickets.
Yeah, so the comment was, everybody's kind of baseline technology capabilities had to rise. If you were a dinosaur and you had a whole team that would come in and help every time you had an issue, maybe you had your kids or grandkids to help with that. But
everyone's more self-sufficient. I was living in London when the pandemic started, and all of a sudden, everyone had to forced to go home, and so I went into the office and just started to send out monitors everywhere and keyboards and all
right.
that stuff, and bought printers on Amazon and all that. And it's funny because my boss, who's sort of the older school as well, said, before this, he said, I never thought it could work. And he said, now, he said, there's no way. So we actually got rid of the expensive office, and it enabled people to actually go for a jog or go for a bike ride in the morning instead of spending, that 45 minutes in the London tube, which was awful. And then, when after the pandemic, we just got a small little once a week. We would just meet at like a WeWork equivalent.
Right.
People from all over England, and it was like really, really great to see everyone. But that was it, and they actually would never go back to it. Yeah. So.
Well, I would just say in closing that this is very true, and we figured out how to work remotely. All of us felt pretty capable once we went home. We knew how to work in the office before we left. We haven't figured out how to bring these two concepts together, and there's still a lot of upside and opportunity of trying to really push hard and trying to tweak the hybrid model. So yeah, hopefully everybody goes back empowered and excited and ready to go evangelize the concept of hybrid some more. Thank you guys so much.